Good, how are you?
I haven't seen you since you got back from Africa.
I know.
Louisiana.
Yeah.
Did you have a great trip?
It was really, really good. And you?
Really good. I enjoyed it very, very much. So good to see you. Glad you get some
Is he speaking today?
Scott?
Yes.
Yes, he's doing his class on singing.
Oh, I've been begging him to do that and talking to Ron with him to do that.
Well, it worked.
If you haven't heard it, if you're going to see it.
Yeah.
The 2-minute bell has come and gone. It's time to begin. We are excited. We had a request from members of the congregation who've been here for a long time. Hey, it's been a long time since we had a study on music in the church. And we know a guy. We do know a guy. I first met Scott, I think about 21 years ago. He had just graduated from high school and was a new member in the church. He was at the time, still is, a music enthusiast. So much so that he has pursued music as a means of making his living for the last 21 years until COVID kind of shot that in the foot. I see, goes in a couple of these notes, I'm not going to cover a couple of things I thought about, but for those of you who don't know, Scott is Ron and Cheryl Gallego's son-in-law. Gara is sitting with Gail, that's their daughter. Their kids are precious to Gail and I, as our Scott and Gail. Scott's a former deacon here. They now attend church at Edmond. When I met Scott, he was a new Christian and had lots of questions. And one of those questions had to do with music, obviously. He spent most of the last 21 years. He accepted what Scripture says about the music, but he spent the last 21 years, I think, kind of figuring out how did the world go so weird when it comes to music. And I'm going to turn it over to him to explain all this.
Yeah, that's been about 20 years. It's hard to believe what time goes quick. It's good to see some of you. It's good to see all of you, really. It's really good to see familiar faces and excited to see and meet some of you who I don't really know. Thanks for the introduction of Art. I appreciate that. And kind of go over a few things in my notes here. Yeah, I was born a Christian in 2001, and the instrumental music question was the primary reason why. I met Dara actually in 8th grade on a school trip to Washington, D.C. Later on, she had invited me to church at the Northside Congregation in North Phoenix. And the first thing I noticed was there was no organ, there's no piano. See, my background is I grew up Methodist. I grew up playing in a steel drum band as part of the church, the Methodist church. And we had performed all over the country in a lot of different denominations. In fact, by the time I was 18 and graduated high school, I had performed in 28 states, some 3,000 performances, and performed on 5 or 6 different recordings that had been published at the time, cassette tapes. 2 of them went to CD. That was my normal growing up. And so, of course, when I first stepped foot in the Church of Christ, it was a shock. And that is what led me to first open a Bible and have some questions for Ron and Dara, of course, and ultimately led to obeying the gospel. My career in education is all about music. I have a bachelor degree in music education and master's, and recently completed a doctorate a year ago. In music education, taught for about 15 years, and as Uncle Har said, COVID happened and nobody knew the band here. So I'm off doing other things now and have enjoyed my time doing that. So I mentioned that because it gives you a little bit of background about who I am, but also gives you a little sense of I'm band director in the Church of Christ. Hold up. and you know, like, were you a good band director? You know, I'm not. It's kind of one of those like, are you teaching today? It kind of depends if you're learning or not, right? And so. I like to think that I have an interesting perspective on both sides. I grew up completely immersed in instrumental music, but we also studied scripture, and I believe in that fully and completely. And so I had a nice little pretty PowerPoint up here and had forgotten my little cable to connect that. So I'll get to see all the pretty pictures. I'll have that next week and show you what I'm seeing up here. Okay, instrumental music. Who, what, where, why? So we have in the archaeological record bone flutes. Do you know about this? Okay, bone flutes made out of bone. I don't know what you believe about carbon dating and the legitimacy of it or how accurate it is. And that's not really the point that I want to make up here right this particular moment. But I want you to know that we have a bone flute, several of them, that are dated to about 3,800 to 4,000 BC. Do you know why that's significant? What was happening in the world 3,800 to 4,000 BC? Anyone know?
The islands were being populated in the Pacific by the Aborigines.
That's true. We have the origination of man occurring about the same time. If you believe the biblical record and you can trace back genealogically, this dates almost exactly after the death of Cain and before Seth. Pretty interesting. Death of Abel. And the birth of Seth would be about that same time frame, 3,800 to 4,000 BC. We found harps in Ur. Does Ur sound familiar to you? Hopefully. Who came out of Ur? Abraham. Okay, we found harps that are dated to 2,400 or 2,450 to 2,550. Again, that's 100 years. A lot has happened. You know, a lot can happen in 100 years. But we found some harps that come out of Ur. 2,500 BC. Anyone know what major biblical character living on Earth about that same time? If you accept the general timeline, Noah is living at this time. In fact, this particular time was about 50 to 100 years before the flood. Do we have a geologist in here anymore? What happens when an item of wood is covered in sediment for a while? Is it preserved? It's petrified.
Yeah.
What happens with this harp that we have? I actually have a picture of it. It's on display in Greece. It's cool. I'll show it to you, but cables are what they are. It's a harp that's petrified, dated to about 2500 BC. If you accept the geological record, this is about 50 to 100 years before the flood. Okay. We have in Ugarit, which is modern day Syria, we have a cuneiform text that's about this big. Although on the screen it'll be huge, but about this big. And it's dated to about 1800 BC. 1800 BC is the time of Isaac, Jacob, and Esau. Although this is also before the 12 tribes would have been established through Rachel and Leah, just before then. This cuneiform tablet has written text on it that is written in meter. Some today will call it poetry. We believe that it's actually a song. We don't have any indication of pitch to have some music go along with it, but it's really unique in that it's not like other documents of the time period in that culture. I'll show a picture of that too when we get there. Moving a little bit closer to the first century, which is really what our target study is, we have the Delphic hymns, the oracles of Delphi. Heard of this? Okay. The oracles of Delphi. And there in Delphi, Greece, we have a very large rock with some inscriptions on it, and we have a hymn that is there. This hymn is pretty precisely dated to 128. It describes some very clear things that are going on in the world. It's fairly corroborated. 128 BC, and this is accepted widely as the first form of written music. 128 BC. I'll say it's the first uncontested form of written music that we have. We have Greek words, and in between the lines are symbols that until 2013 were undecipherable. In 2013, we found basically a codex that interpreted the Delphic hymns. And so we were able to not only find out that, yeah, this is actually music, we know how it sounded. There's some research at university levels that had recreated this. It is weird. But we'll let it go from there. Okay, this is kind of an introduction. Music has been found in every culture. Ever discovered. So evidence of music, depiction and artwork, music has been found everywhere, in every culture, ever known to man. And so have musical instruments. I talked about the bone flute, dated to 4000 BC. Of course, drums, is kind of the classic, caveman, hit drums. Actually, the bone flute that came around first. We didn't figure out the hit things until later. We know that music has been performed. We don't necessarily know how it was performed. We just know that it was. We have artist renderings, we have cave paintings, we have all sorts of things that show different types of music. And again, widely said that the Delphic hymns are the oldest form of written music we have. Greece, therefore, is credited with creating musical notation. And it was believed widely, we also know that music was believed to have some sort of supernatural power, that Greek gods and demigods were the first practitioners of music. And of course, this is all in mythology, we know that they weren't, but that's the myth, and we got to start from somewhere. So the Greco-Roman Empire was kind of the thing, and that's the general philosophy. Okay? That music was practiced by gods and demigods. It was thought that music could heal sickness, purify the body and the mind, and work miracles in nature. And so the thought was, if we can practice music, we are also practicing medicine. We're also practicing healing. We're practicing community. That's the thought, okay? We have some records of this actually in the Bible. If you want to turn real quick to Joshua 6, there's a little known story in there about a fortress called Jericho. What happened to Jericho? The walls come tumbling down, right? How did the walls come tumbling down? Trumpet blast. Well, was it really the trumpet blast? No. We know that it was God. Okay? The Israelites, they circled around, they followed the word of God. God made the walls come down. We know that. What does secular history teach us about the walls of Jericho? Do you know that this event is actually recorded in other cultures? Other cultures attribute the walls, they don't deny that the walls fell down after the trumpet blast. That's recorded in history. How cool is that? What was attributed is that the sound of the trumpet caused the walls to fall down. Not God himself. Okay, if you look over at 1 Samuel chapter 16, David makes Saul feel better by playing his harp. Okay? What's also interesting is that this is also recorded in the annals of secular history. It's actually, we can kind of date that to about 1100 BC or so. And again, it's not God, it is the power of music, making you feel better. Music therapy in the Bible. No. But that was the thought, that music heals, purifies body and mind, works miracles in nature. And again, if you could command music, then you can command nature. That was the thought. Okay, so let's kind of take a step back real quick. Here's what we have. Music existed since the beginning. Music's found everywhere. And music has some sort of spiritual connection since the very beginning. The texts that we find that are metrical are sacred in nature, all of them. Now, when I say sacred, I don't necessarily mean biblically sacred. Okay, I mean like to their gods, the Greek gods, the gods worshipped in Samaria. That's what it was for. Music was a religious experience since the very, very beginning. All right. Moving forward, since the 6th century BC, moving on, music flourished in the Greco-Roman Empire. The lyre, the kithara, and the aulos are the most common instruments found. The lyre, I think we're pretty well familiar with. Okay, the smallish instrument right here have a couple of horns, usually about 6 strings. The kithara is actually in the Bible several times, except it's called the instrument of 10 strings, or the instrument of 11 strings. The kithara was an instrument that was just essentially the larger version of the lyre, and it had multiple strings to it, however many you needed. Music theory was non-existent. You can't even say primitive. It was non-existent at this time. And so if you needed a certain type of note, you just added a string that kind of got you close to it. And so you added multiple strings to kind of get you a little more flexibility. And so you had the instrument of 10 strings. It's a kithara, but a kithara wasn't standardized. There was all sorts of different forms. Not unlike drums. We say, do you play the drums? Maybe, but what does that mean? What size was it used for? Kind of the same thing. Do you play the kithara? The aulos we'll get into here in a second. That's an interesting instrument. Plato's Republic. Anyone heard of Plato? This is stuff we throw at kids. Okay. His Republic. Any of you read it? Plato's Republic? Good, don't. It's you have trouble sleeping at night. Plato's Republic. In it, Plato, and we've heard of Plato, yes? Okay, most of Western thought is based on Plato. Okay, in his Republic, which outlines his rules for civilian government and what is a civil society, says explicitly that school children should learn to play the lyre. In fact, it was on that basis that the Greco-Roman Empire adopted the lyre as part of a general social standing. And we'll get to that in just a few seconds. But hold that thought, the dusty part of your brain, we'll get that in a second. Okay, context for instrumentalists and vocalists. in music. This is again in the Greek Roman Empire. That was really, really common to see, mostly for men or informal contests. Women could perform as like a street musician and informally, like at dinner parties. Men could not perform in a quote unquote social setting. They could perform much more formally than that. I think a little small tangent here. Anyone heard the word symposium? I'm going to a symposium this weekend, right? Okay. That originated in Greek culture. The symposium was exclusively men who got together, usually at somebody's house, and they would discuss the politics of the day. Okay, so let's fast forward a couple thousand years, and now we're into the new world. Okay, maybe even yesterday. OU game, right? A bunch of guys getting together in the house. What happens? Do these guys get together and they immediately pull chairs around and turn on TV? No, they talk about something, right? There's usually something, small talk that's how's the weather, how's the family, how's the kids, what are you doing at work, right? That's what the symposium was. Guys are getting together in somebody's house and they would chit chat for a little bit. And then they would discuss the politics of the day. One of the things that was very common and expected as part of the symposium was to play a musical instrument. It was a jam session. This wasn't just to get together, to kind of jam together on your lyre, to see how kind of things, words were just kind of hanging out. It was a pecking order. It was to establish where you were in that social circle at that moment. They used instruments to determine your social status. I can't emphasize this enough. Okay? This is again the great Greco-Roman Empire from the 6th century to the 1st. We have all sorts of different things happening. With the political discussions of the symposium, that expanded out into theaters, that expanded into what you talked about at work. Being able to play an instrument is like what some businesses consider to be golf today. It's just an expected part of who you are as a businessman. Does it make sense? Okay, you follow me? So it's really important to understand that because when we were in a little bit next week, I'll show you the pictures of these theaters. You can go to theaters and listen to these musicians. Men would go and perform in a theater as like a concert tour. In fact, we have records of this where musicians would travel all around the known empire just to perform for people. Not unlike today, we have you have your favorite artists that would come and they would come to town. Oh, so and so's in town. Let's go hear them. There's actually a record of one family traveling. It was something like traveling at 90 miles just to hear their favorite musician play. It was kind of a big deal. These theaters were huge and immense, and around these theaters were forums, markets, shops, and in that area that's where you had your street musicians. That's where women would perform. That's where children would learn how to play. Teachers who were not formally teaching would come out and give lessons to the crowd. You'd have informal jam sessions happening while you're buying your produce, while you're talking to someone else, buying your linens. So I hope we painted a picture that instrumental music was kind of widespread. It was common. We've heard this. Okay. If you see the movies and it's depicted as like this ancient Roman province or this Greek province, and there's nobody playing an instrument in the background, it's historically incorrect. Okay. These were very, very common things to see. Okay. We'll show you some theaters next week, but we have a couple. A city called Corinth had a theater in Paul's Bay that seated 14,000 people. That's a lot of people. What's the population of Edmond? Anyone know right now?
About 95 or 100,000.
It's about right. Okay, 14,000. A theater seating 14,000 people. Corinth. That's a lot. Kind of put some things in perspective. Ephesus theater is huge. 24,000 people could seat in that theater. 3 tiers. Enormous. what are they doing to see 24,000 people? And it's just a theater. It's an amphitheater, right? This isn't like a basketball arena where you can do this with, you could have these sporting events. Yeah, there were sporting events that occurred, but they were just like one-on-one little bouts. They didn't like happen in the theater. That happened in the forums next to it called the gymnasium, okay? These theaters were here for like political. When we read about Paul going and speaking to the crowds, sometimes that occurred in the synagogue, the temple, but this is where he would have done that, in the theater. People would have gathered around where they could hear him. Rome had a theater, we call it the Colosseum. That one, I need to get in my notes because this is funny. So we're going to find my notes. Oh, here we are. The Codex calendar of 354. Anyone read that? No, okay. The Codex calendar of 354 is evidently a Roman census in 354, okay? AD, by the way, and it identifies this structure, the Roman Colosseum, as a, quote, houses 85,000 citizens and a few less fortunate. I think that's funny. I mean, who are the unfortunates? Probably not those in the seats, right? 85,000 is what that says. Modern archaeology suggests that's closer to 50. So we don't know if just people's sizes have grown that much, or if we're missing part of a significant part of the structure. We just don't know. Okay, so we've thrown some things out. You can't see it, of course. But let's put this into perspective here. How many of you have seen in Oklahoma City the Paycom Center? Or whatever you want to call it, Chesapeake Arena or Ford Arena or the thing downtown, right? Where the Thunder play. You've seen that building? 18,203 seats. 18,000 for a city of Oklahoma City. What's the population of the greater Oklahoma City metro area? Depends on how many places you want to consider, right? And then are we counting Norman? We're going as far out as that window, right? How far do we go? If you want to do a real blunt general, we're about 1 million people. And we have a major arena for a national basketball team, or hockey, or however, whichever, major music stars coming in. That seats 18,000 in its greatest, highest capacity configuration. 18,000. Ephesus had 24. Corinth had 14. And the purpose for these theaters was for theatrical performance, music performances, and occasionally political debates, crowning athletic winners too. These were huge centers for social life. Okay, these were huge. It was enormous. I'll show you some pictures also about the comparison in size. The Colosseum is enormous. It is a full city block. Have you seen that structure in person? I have not. I'll show you some satellite images. But the Ephesus Theater, the one that's 24,000, is bigger than the entire Paycom Center. It's kind of incredible. Okay, so back up again. So what? We know that music existed since forever. We also know that music is found in every culture. We also know that music was metrical. We also know that music was primarily sacred. I can't say entirely sacred because we haven't discovered every document ever, but all the documents that have been discovered are sacred in nature. We also know that when we fast forward closer to the 1st century, we know that instrumental music was not only just around, it thrived, it flourished, and it was expected that you knew something about it. We also know that it permeated every aspect of Greco-Roman life: worship, education, entertainment, politics, you name it, instrumental music was part of it. Music in general was part of it, not necessarily exclusively instrumental. Vocal was in there as well. Maybe a small caveat here, because I just kind of, instrumental music did not exist exclusively by itself. Okay, we didn't have somebody on the street corner just strumming the lute. Okay, things like harmony, chord progressions, plucking out a melody, that didn't exist. that wasn't what music was for, instrumental music. Instrumental music supported a vocal performance. It was, think about movies that you may have seen, maybe times period in the Renaissance where you have like someone in the court of the king and they're like strumming something while they're reciting an epic poem. Okay, that's kind of along the lines of what instrumental music was. It was an accompaniment to the telling of a story through song. And now here we have, or two roads diverge. We have Greek, and we have, well, I would refer to as Jewish music because the age of Christianity hadn't been established at the time period that I'm talking about. Okay, Jewish, Greco-Roman music. The lyrics, they were metered, they were metrical. There was some rhyme, or not necessarily, there was rhyme to it, but there was a rhythm to the pattern of syllables. We also know that it was primarily accompanied by musical instruments. Again, social standing, right? If I'm a musician and I want to show that I know the history of this place, or I want to tell a part of Greek mythology, or I want to tell this story of how it came to be, I'm going to use an instrument. Otherwise, it's just kind of not valid. You don't really have any social standing with someone who's not playing an instrument. And isn't that kind of like what it is today? Do we feel that in the church today where we have a cappella only music? We almost have to justify it sometimes, don't we? Well, I go to XYZ church and we use instruments and I appreciate that worship better. I don't know about those guys who just sing, right? There's almost a social status associated with the way that music is performed. Think about different genres of music. You have country, rock. What about bluegrass? So folk music that you might think of. We also have a hierarchy within music itself of what is more important. Okay? Think about that in the time of the first century. If you're trying to perform something and have some validity and have some social standing, you're going to use the tools that give you that social standing. And that was the lyre. Okay? Now, on the other side, Jewish music. Jewish music around the first century. When I say around, I'm really talking about roughly 200 years on either side of 0 to 8. Okay. I realize that 200 years is more than a century. But that's the kind of the general time period here, okay? Jewish music was antiphonal. Do you know what that means? An antiphone. An antiphone is a musical term that just means unmetered, not metrical. Those of you who have studied music a little bit, particularly in the medieval time, they know the chant, the Gregorian chant. That's what it comes out to, okay? So ultimately will evolve to is the Gregorian chant. But the idea that you're going to take a text and you're going to deliberately eliminate rhyme, you're going to deliberately eliminate rhythm, and so that you're focusing on what's left. The words. That's all you have left. So where does rhythm come in? But an element of music has to be rhythm. If you don't have rhythm, you don't have music. Unless you got the girlfriends, you're going to disagree. But then you got words, you have pitch. That's all that they needed in order to establish music. In fact, in this songbook here, in this building, there is a printed text in that form. I don't recall the exact number, but I do remember seeing it. If you look it up, you just be a whole note and a whole bunch of words. And then another note and a whole bunch of words. Okay? I'll find it. I'll find it. And that's what it is. It's like singing Amazing, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. The rhythm comes from the syllables, which emphasizes the word. If you want to emphasize something about it, you would use other forms of literary device, but not rhyme. Rhyme was Greek. Rhyme was Roman. Rhyme was pagan. You would use things like alliteration. to emphasize the point. Paul knew that, he wrote it in his letters. Those of you who study Greek a little bit. Melodies were exclusively vocal. We know that. We don't know exactly how early Christian hymns sounded, but we have really clear records that it was 100% unaccompanied. We'll talk about why in just a little bit. The question that I had, the real question I had is, we have instruments all over the New or Old Testament, right? I mean, all over the Old Testament, we have instruments. By the time the New Testament comes around, it's completely silent. What happened? Why? And that begins this little deep dive. Okay, music, saturated Jewish practices. It's all over the place. From Genesis, Job, 1 Samuel, 2 Chronicles, you find it. Almost every book has some reference to an instrument of some kind. Raised the horn, tambour, lyre, the psalter. They're all over the place. And musical instruments were super common. And in fact, in 1 Chronicles 25, we have a command to the temple musicians to play musical instruments. And they did. We have a time period of silence between the Old Testament and New Testament, and a lot of stuff has happened, including the removal of instrumental music. So no Jewish practices from within that time period comes from, musical practices, comes from almost just one source, the Talmud, dated to about 200 AD. It's really specific. Like, it's almost oddly specific. But it's only one source that comes to us from that time period about musical practices in Jewish worship. And I find it to be interesting. The temple, even at the time, first century, was full of musical instruments. Temple worship in Jerusalem involved musical instruments. Synagogue worship, not. There were no instruments permitted in synagogues, only in the temple. Think about that for just a second. Why would that be? Why would the temple in Jerusalem allow instruments, but all the areas, synagogues, no? Any thoughts?
Synagogue was a place of learning.
Yes, that's one. But not just a place of learning, a place of what kind of learning?
It's where they were commanded.
What's that?
It's where they were commanded in the temple.
They were commanded to be in the temple, yes, absolutely. Who was commanded to play? What tribe? Levites. Where were the Levites?
Not in the synagogue.
Not in the synagogues. Levites were in the temple. Levites were temple musicians. And that was the end of that. Okay? Instruments were not permitted in synagogues, partly because the Levites were the ones to be commanded. It was very select and elite. And it was also isolated exclusively to that location because that's where they were. There's also another reason, and we tapped on it over here just a little bit. Synagogues were a place of learning. What kind of learning? Scriptural, spiritual learning. This wasn't a Greek school that was following Plato. This wasn't Roman. This was Jewish. We're going to teach you the scriptures. We're going to debate and discuss spiritual things, right? Enter in Philo of Alexandria. He lived from roughly 20, maybe 30 BC, died in 50 AD. He crossed millennial epochs of BC to AD. I don't think he knew it at the time. But from 20 BC to 50 AD, okay? What's really interesting about Philo of Alexandria, he's from Alexandria, Egypt. What's interesting about him is that he was a devout Jew. So the term wouldn't be applied correctly, but we can call him a monk. Priest of some kind. He emphasized the value of spiritual singing over a physical expression of worship. It was kind of revolutionary for that time period. To essentially say, and this is completely out of context and over exaggeration, but to drive the point home, this would be the equivalent of him in Jewish society saying, we no longer need to burn incense. We no longer need to slaughter goats. We no longer need to do these physical acts to show worship. It is about the heart. Again, way over exaggeration. That's not what he said. But that's essentially what the effect would have been to say spiritual worship is the most important thing over physical expression. That includes musical instruments, according to Philo. Also, really interesting little side note. Philo was in Rome in 38 AD. Roughly 10, 20 years, I think, before Paul was there. We also know that Philo was in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. We know that Philo was in Jerusalem at the time of the triumphal entry. We know that. And he still wrote about the emphasis of spiritual things over the physical expression thing. I think that's really important. I don't think that can be understated. We also have another document, if you will. It's really a series of 12, maybe up to 14 books called the Civil Oracles. Do you know about this? Okay, the Civil Oracles. The earliest one dated to around 150 BC. The oldest that we know of is about 180 AD. We say 12, maybe 14 books. There are references to other oracles that we haven't found yet or have just been flat lost. So we don't know. The Sibyls were a subgroup of priests of sorts. It wasn't like some sort of like mystical group of sorts. It was just a title. That's all that it was. But the purpose of the oracles or records was to document the spiritual health of the world at the time. Okay, multiple authors, of course. Again, 150 BC to 180 AD. This is a long period of time. Okay, 300 years. And over that time, all of these monks, again, term used anachronistically, but these monks would write down what the spiritual health of the world was. And it's all over the place. We have a record of what Greek mythology was. We have a record of what Hellenistic views were, Jewish views, and even Christian views of the time period. But they are consistent over those 300 years that first, pagan music was to be avoided. And what's really interesting is that in book 8, there is a reference to instrumental music that it should also be avoided and inappropriate. The word is inappropriate for Jewish music. I think that's interesting. We have another thing that is really kind of disregarded in importance in the scope of history. I think it's more important than what historians have made mention of it. There was an actual ban of musical instruments by Jewish leaders in the first century. A ban of musical instruments to be performed on the Sabbath. It was against the Sabbath to play a musical instrument on the Sabbath. There's a ban. I think that speaks volumes for the philosophy of what instrumental music was in Jewish to be later coined Christian worship. Okay, that was a lot of words. We have a dichotomy now. We have, on one hand, we have the Greco-Roman Empire, where music is saturated in society, if not a status symbol. Then we have Judeo-Christian practices, where instrumental music is, maybe you can use the word shunned. The focus is not on a physical expression. The focus is on the spiritual worship of the heart. And there are very specific references to ignore it. At the same time period in history. How do we square that? I don't think we need to. I think it's pretty clear. So the question that I have next is, so when was instrumental music actually introduced? Okay, now we'll fast forward. Now that we have an understanding of what life was like in the first century of these two, we're going to move a lot faster. Okay, so here we go. First, what was the first instrument to be introduced into the church? The church, talking globally, secularly. What was it? The organ. undisputed. When was it introduced?
600.
666 AD. I think that's that number. I think that's hilarious too. 666 AD. Pope Vitalian I. How would you like to be that guy? The Pope introducing an instrument that was shunned for 600-700 years into the church in that year. Man, you had one opportunity and you blew it. Okay. Pope Vitalian I in the 7th century, 666 AD, is credited with introducing the organ. I doubt it. We'll get into that later. It's really not until the 10th century, almost 1100, where we actually have real records of the organ being used in a Roman Catholic facility. It's not used in the worship service at that point. It's used before or after as kind of like a solo teaching, kind of like a call to worship. Like we have a bell here, very similar. Organist would play, do things. These were loud instruments, and so it was to attract the crowds to come to worship. It was not used in worship, and that's very clear. It wasn't actually used in an actual worship service at least in not written record, until almost the 13th century. That's a long way. Touch on these last little things, and then I'll save the rest for next week because there are some pictures that are pretty important. The organ, real quick, is not a new instrument at the time that Vitalian said that it's credited to introducing it. It was actually invented in 250 BC by a Roman inventor, Phidias. He is the father of hydraulics. He was trying to create essentially water-powered tools to make life easier for Roman citizens. And during some of his tests, he forgot to add the water. And so we had air flowing through these pipes, and it created loud sounds, vibrations, thus creating essentially the beginning of what an air-operated organ would have been. He worked with some musicians at the time. Why musicians? Because they had the social status. Okay? He worked with musicians to turn it into something useful. And then, believe it or not, there was an actual keyboard on this thing. Not the keyboard that wouldn't be functional like we had today, but it was a press a button and a certain pitch would emulate. That was our second one. That didn't redundant, right? Okay, real quick, last summary statement. Fast forward over time, and the organ was used for things like gladiatory battles, announcing emperors, and military conquest. I'll leave that with you as to maybe why the organ was not really accepted in the church. Thank you guys. We'll talk more later.